You step off the plane excited and almost instantly you feel it. The stares, the tone, that unspoken message of, yeah, you're not welcome here. If you've ever traveled abroad and thought, why do they hate Americans? This video is for you. Some cities are openly fed up with American tourists. Here's the crazy part. These places are still some of the most famous destinations on Earth, with incredible food, world-class history, and bucket list views. But the experience can flip fast if you don't understand the local mood. Now let's be real. Some of this is politics, some of it is culture clash. And yeah, sometimes Americans earn the reputation. So today we are breaking down 10 famous cities where Americans feel unwelcome. Stick around because number 2 shocks almost everyone. And if you want more helpful travel videos, hit subscribe, and let's get into it. 10. Venice, Italy. Venice is overwhelmed, and that's the core reason many Americans feel unwelcome here. This city has fewer than 50,000 permanent residents and welcomes tens of millions of tourists every year. Locals aren't annoyed at you personally, they're exhausted by the system, and Americans often get caught in that backlash. When Americans show up loud, excited, and wide-eyed in the city that's literally sinking and losing residents every year, that can come across as disrespectful, even if it's unintentional. Another issue is behavior. Venice has strict rules now. No sitting on certain steps, no eating in certain areas, no swimming in canals. Yes, some people have tried that. Americans who don't know or ignore these rules get fined, corrected, or openly scolded, which can feel hostile. What makes it worse is expectation. Americans arrive expecting romance and warmth. But here's the truth. Venice isn't anti-American, it's anti-chaos. Travelers who move slower, blend in, and respect the pressure locals are under often notice attitudes soften. Still, the tension is real, and it's growing. And if Venice felt strict, just wait. The next city shows what happens when tourism pressure mixes with nightlife. 9. Bangkok, Thailand. Bangkok can feel intimidating for Americans because it refuses to slow down or soften itself for outsiders. This city doesn't revolve around tourists. People are busy, systems are different, social norms aren't explained, and Americans who are used to friendliness signaling safety sometimes interpret neutrality as rejection. One major issue is cultural misalignment. Americans value openness and casual interaction. Bangkok values respect, hierarchy, and emotional control. So when an American jokes with a stranger, questions instructions, or speaks loudly out of frustration, it can damage how they're perceived. No one yells at you, they just disengage. There's also accumulated frustration toward Western tourism, party culture, digital nomads treating the city like a cheap playground, and certain industries tied to exploitation have shaped perceptions. Americans aren't singled out, but often lumped in. That's why some travelers feel dismissed or ignored, especially in tourist-heavy zones. My advice? Adjust your lens. Observe first. Speak softly. Follow local cues. When Americans do that, Bangkok becomes very rewarding. But if you expect it to feel like a Western city with Thai food, you'll feel out of place fast. And coming up next is a place that most tourists wouldn't expect. 8. Bali, Indonesia. Bali confuses Americans because it feels welcoming on the surface, yet emotionally distant underneath. And that's because Bali has learned to protect itself after decades of heavy Western tourism. A big issue is how Americans often frame Bali as a budget paradise, a healing retreat, or a place to escape real life. Locals see something else: rising rents, crowded roads, sacred spaces treated like Instagram sets. Over time, that creates resentment. Another factor is transactional interaction. Tourism is the main economy, so friendliness becomes professional. Americans expecting deeper cultural connection without investing time, learning customs, or leaving tourist zones feel disappointed and misinterpret that as unwelcoming. Here's some advice. Bali responds to humility. Learn what's sacred. Dress appropriately. Ask questions that aren't about prices. When locals realize you see Bali as a living culture, not a backdrop, something shifts. If that subtle tension surprised you, brace yourself, because the next city makes its frustrations much more visible. And before we continue, if this kind of travel talk helps you, make sure you're subscribed. 7. Mexico City, Mexico. This city doesn't feel unwelcoming to Americans because of culture or history. It feels tense because of what's happening right now. Over the last few years, waves of Americans arrived with U.S.-level incomes, remote jobs, and spending power that completely reshaped certain neighborhoods almost overnight. Rents doubled. Local cafes turned into international spots. Long-time residents were priced out. That kind of change creates resentment fast, and Americans are the most visible symbol of it. So when you visit, you might notice shorter interactions, less patience, or a feeling that you're being watched more carefully. That's not hostility, it's fatigue and frustration. Especially if you stay in gentrified areas, Locals may assume you're part of the problem before you ever open your mouth. Speaking only English, comparing prices to the US, or calling neighborhoods cheap makes that gap wider instantly. Effort matters here more than almost anywhere. Learn a little Spanish, ask questions about the city's history, not just where the Wi-Fi is fastest. Americans who do this often experience warmth, humor, and generosity because Mexico City wants respectful visitors. And next up, we head somewhere that looks calm and romantic, but is quietly overwhelmed. 6. Santorini, Greece. Santorini is a perfect example of a place that looks welcoming but feels closed. And once you understand why, it makes a lot more sense. The island is tiny, yet it absorbs massive numbers of tourists every single day, many arriving for just a few rushed hours from cruise ships. Locals aren't reacting to you, they're reacting to constant pressure. Americans tend to feel this more because they often arrive expecting warmth, conversation, and flexibility. And when Americans complain about crowds or costs, locals think that Americans don't see what they have to deal with every day. That gap creates distance fast. There's also frustration with behavior, blocking narrow streets for photos, treating private property like public space, and prioritizing social media over situational awareness. Again, Americans aren't the only ones doing this, but often the most visible. Locals save their warmth for people who slow down. Visit off-season, stay overnight, explore beyond the cliffside views. Don't rush sunsets like a checklist item. When you do that, attitudes soften and conversations happen. Santorini teaches a quiet lesson. Beauty attracts crowds, and crowds change places. And if this one surprised you, number 5 challenges Americans even more. 5. Florence, Italy. Florence can feel surprisingly cold to Americans. It isn't tired of visitors, it's tired of being consumed. Locals don't see their city as a tourist destination first. They see it as a place of work, study, and daily life that also happens to contain world-class art. When Americans arrive treating Florence like a highlight reel, rushing from museum to museum, eating wherever has the biggest sign, locals often read that as shallow, even if it's unintentional. Service may feel short or indifferent. Florentines expect you to know how things work or to quietly figure it out. When Americans ask for special treatment or compare everything to back home, patience drops fast. There's also pride at play here. Florence gave the world the Renaissance. Locals feel a responsibility to protect that legacy, not perform it. When visitors treat historic spaces like photo ops rather than cultural spaces, it reinforces the idea that Americans are here to take, not understand. Florence rewards respect for rhythm. Dress well, move slower, learn when to speak and when not to. When locals see genuine interest, the tone softens noticeably. Florence isn't unwelcoming, it's discerning. And if this city felt reserved, the next one takes that tension and adds a whole new layer of visibility. 4. Dubrovnik, Croatia. Dubrovnik feels unwelcoming to many Americans because the city experienced fame faster than it could emotionally process it. What was once a quiet, lived-in coastal town became a global attraction almost overnight. Locals didn't gradually adapt, they were flooded. Cruise ships arrived, streets clogged, homes turned into short-term rentals, and the daily lives of residents were pushed aside to make room for visitors. Americans often feel this frustration in strict rules, blunt corrections, and an overall sense that tourists are being managed, not welcomed. When Americans stop in the middle of narrow streets, ignore signage, or treat the old town like a movie set, locals react quickly. Dubrovnik has had to put up boundaries just to survive. There's also resentment toward short-term visitors who contribute to congestion without contributing to community. Day trippers, especially from cruise ships, symbolize that problem. Americans staying only a few hours may feel dismissed or rushed because, frankly, locals assume they'll be gone soon anyway. Dubrovnik responds to time and curiosity. Stay longer, leave the walls. Eat where locals eat. When residents see you treating Dubrovnik as a place, not a product, attitudes change. And if Dubrovnik's pushback surprised you, brace yourself. Number 3 challenges Americans in even more personal ways. 3. Kyoto, Japan. Kyoto is where many Americans first realize that politeness does not equal welcome. On the surface, everything feels respectful. Smiles, bowing, clean streets. But emotionally, Kyoto can feel distant, even isolating. The core issue is cultural mismatch. American behavior, casual conversation, expressive body language, questioning rules clashes sharply with Kyoto's values of restraint, harmony, and non-disruption. Even well-meaning mistakes stand out. Talking loudly on trains, treating sacred spaces like tourist attractions. Locals won't correct you, they'll quietly withdraw. Another factor is over-tourism. Kyoto's historic districts are under enormous strain. Traditions have become commercialized and private neighborhoods turned into walking tours. Americans, as highly visible foreigners, often absorb that frustration even if they've done nothing wrong. Kyoto requires humility. Observe before acting, follow the flow, respect silence. When Americans adapt, barriers lower, kindness deepens, and moments feel genuinely special. But Kyoto doesn't meet you halfway. It asks you to come all the way to it. And if that level of adjustment sounds challenging, the next city adds blunt honesty to the mix. 2. Amsterdam, Netherlands. Amsterdam often shocks Americans because it feels blunt in an unusual way. This is a city built on directness, efficiency, and personal responsibility, and none of that comes wrapped in small talk. In reality, locals aren't being rude, they're being normal by their standards. But that cultural gap can feel like rejection. Another major reason Americans feel unwelcome here is behavior associated with tourism. Amsterdam has spent years dealing with party culture, drug tourism, and loud weekend visitors. When locals enforce rules strictly, especially around bikes, noise, or public behavior, Americans sometimes interpret that firmness as hostility. There's also growing frustration tied to housing and quality of life. Short-term rentals, overcrowding, and rising prices have made locals more vocal about protecting their city. Americans who ignore signs, walk in bike lanes, or debate rules stand out fast. And in a culture that values order, standing out is not a compliment. Amsterdam doesn't reward charm, it rewards awareness. Follow the rules. Don't overshare. Respect personal space. When Americans adjust, locals are fair, helpful, and kind. But if you expect emotional cushioning, this city won't offer it. And if Amsterdam felt direct, the next city on this list feels heavy for entirely different reasons. 1. Moscow, Russia. Moscow ranks at the top because Americans often feel unwelcome here before they've even said a word. This isn't about tourism fatigue or manners. It's about history, politics, and long-standing mistrust. Decades of geopolitical tension shape how interactions feel, especially in formal or public spaces. Locals are reserved by default. Smiles aren't automatic. Curiosity is cautious. Casual friendliness can come across as superficial or naive. Even well-meaning questions can feel intrusive if they touch sensitive topics. There's also strong national pride. Criticism, jokes, or comparisons to the West often land poorly. Americans who assume shared values or political alignment can hit invisible walls quickly. This creates emotional distance that feels personal even when it isn't. Yet when Americans listen more than they speak, avoid assumptions with respect, connections form quietly, often one-on-one, and feel meaningful rather than performative. Moscow demands patience. And for Americans, that can be the most challenging adjustment of all. If this list changed how you see these cities, let me know which one surprised you the most in the comments.